know that, first of all, thank you. There's so much happening on campus today, from this forum to the student organizing, student-run excellent TEDx that we had earlier, and some of the faculty members that are here participated in that, to the topping off ceremony that we just finished, to on and on and on and on. To a panel discussion with faculty on how to be more inclusive of students of color in the classroom. So we're talking about lots of wonderful topics on campus today. The breadth and liveliness of today's activities are something that reminds me of our busy, our diverse university, whose members have so much to share. I'm so grateful that you participate fully in these opportunities. We're only growing busier, we're growing more diverse, we're growing in our ability to talk and communicate with each other. You know, this is really the second of this kind of opportunity. We started this last year, right after the Boston Marathon bombing, and as we do move forward together, it's natural for us to disagree from time to time. It's also natural for us to examine ourselves, step back, try to understand each other, because this will help us grow, but it will also help us thrive as a community. This annual panel discussion is a valuable part of our Seeds Week, which is an opportunity for intellectual renewal and a spring cleaning of the mind. And as most of you know, the inspiration of this particular topic of discussion, the inspiration for this year's topic of discussion was a lively debate on our online news page over the American Studies Association's resolution to join the boycott of Israeli academic institutions. We wished to bring this conversation offline and into the realm of human interaction, because I believe it's important for us to sit down and have these conversations together. In person, it's much easier to see each other's humanity across our positions. So thank you for being willing to do that. I'm honored to be a part of this community, a community that understands how important it is for us to have these kind of conversations. As Chancellor, I value the passion that you brought to this conversation, because I know it's the same passion you bring to the classroom. And if it was any different, it wouldn't be the University of Massachusetts, Boston. You bring it to the classrooms, you bring it to our students every day. When I watch them today, Darren, you were there. It's a tremendous example of each and every one of you. It's a passion for social justice. It's a passion for equality. It's a passion for human rights, for the respect for institutions that embody these values, for finding solutions to real-world problems. Your passions is what makes our university one that is great. What I also treasure about being part of this university with you in this community is that we can trust each other with our beliefs. We stand up for the rights of our students and colleagues to hold and advocate for their opinions and their views. Above all, we respect each other, period. We may occasionally disagree about the best way to move forward, but we keep moving together, and I appreciate that. Before we start the discussion, I just want to thank the provost for leading the charge to ensure that an event of this type, tone, and quality that befits a public research university would take place. I'd like to thank those who are helping to facilitate it today. I want to thank those faculty members, all of the community that I hold in high esteem, those who have been friends for a long time and new friends. Thank you for bringing all of this to my attention. We have our moderator today who will be introduced, I think, brought up here, Darren Q. Our panel members, Rachel Rubin, Paul Watanabe, David Levy, and Gonzalo Bon Chipalu. Bon, I told her we're going to get this right. Bon Sigabalu, right? Bon Sigabalu. Tell me. Basigalupe. Okay, you told me. I told you earlier we're going to get it right. Because as we all know names, people call me Motley, 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 and all that. And I understand it's not the right thing. So, also, we have speakers, introductory speakers. Letta Forsac and also David Motz. Thank you as well to our Honors College Dean, Rajani Shrinkam, for your support and promotion of this event and this conversation. With open minds, compassionate hearts, and kind words, let us begin our discussion.
Good afternoon, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here for this really important conversation entitled "Is Academic Boycott of Israel Justified?" The conversation we're about to have today is actually, in my opinion, an event of national and historic significance. To my knowledge, no administration at any college or university in the United States has to date allowed any such dialogue to take place on their campus. Much less have they openly sponsored that conversation. In undertaking precisely this, the provost and the chancellor are unrivaled by their national peers. By hosting this conversation, they demonstrate their and UMass Boston's commitment to the important values of free speech and academic freedom. So I'm going to ask that all of you join me in thanking Chancellor Motley and Provost Lamont. The Chancellor and Provost's sponsorship of this event makes clear that UMass Boston is a campus committed to dialogue and intellectual exchange, even on difficult or controversial political issues. Indeed, not only is this a conversation about academic boycott, a political tactic often deemed beyond the pale or dismissed out of hand as indefensible, but it is a conversation about academic boycott of Israel, a subject that is increasingly taboo on campuses across the country. Indeed, over the past few months, we have witnessed, for example, just in our own city, the administration of Northeastern University singling out its student group, Students for Justice in Palestine, for exceptional disciplinary measures and suspending this group without cause in an attempt to stifle the free exchange of ideas about Israel-Palestine on their campus. After an enormously passionate public and international pressure campaign, Northeastern's administration recently relented, I don't know if you heard, and reinstated SJP, a victory for those students and also for free speech and for academic freedom. It is a relief and also a badge of pride to know that we need not worry about such draconian policing of political speech at UMass Boston, a campus committed to the values of free speech and academic freedom. Not only this, but here we are also a campus that is committed to the broader principles of social justice and human rights, as evidenced, I think, by all of the people who are here in this room today. Indeed, it is precisely because of these commitments that our administration felt it necessary to hold this important conversation about academic boycott. Not only then are we here to engage in an exercise of free speech and academic freedom, we are also here to engage in dialogue about the meaning and content of social justice and human rights, principles clearly of central importance to our students, faculty, staff, and administration. As the Chancellor mentioned, today's panel came into being as the result of a specific set of events and exchanges between faculty and staff members and the Chancellor himself. As you may know, in December of last year, and as the Chancellor already mentioned, I'm sure we all know about it, that's why we're all here, the American Studies Association passed a resolution in support of the academic boycott of Israel. Approximately a month later, in January, some of us became aware of a statement by Chancellor Motley posted on the UMass Boston website proclaiming that, quote, as an institution, UMass Boston strongly opposes the boycott of Israeli academic institutions announced by the American Studies Association, unquote. Not everyone, however, on our campus agreed with this position, and as a result, some of us approached the Chancellor with our concerns in the form of a letter signed by more than 50 faculty and staff. To our enormous pleasure, Chancellor Motley responded to our concerns with promptness, thoughtfulness, and care. He made it possible for us to upload our own statement of support for the ASA resolution to the UMB website. He also suggested that we hold this campus event today wherein we discuss the issue of academic boycott itself, its purposes, its justification, its effectiveness. And that is why we're here in this room today. That's how this event came to be. And I just want you to know that there are copies of both the Chancellor's statement and our own statement. I put hard copies of both of those statements on the 2 tables in the back of the room. So you can feel free to take a look at them or grab a copy on your way out or whatever. Again, and I'm almost done. I wish to emphasize that this is the first and only such event of this kind happening anywhere on any campus in the entire United States in the aftermath of the ASA resolution. This fact alone makes me proud to be part of this institution. But I'm also moved by the commitment of so many on this campus to thinking seriously, thoughtfully, and communally about the issues raised by academic boycott of Israel in particular, because I am proud to be part of a campus that is so clearly committed to social justice and human rights. As the Chancellor acknowledged, we may not always agree with one another on the best way to advance those goals or further their place in the world. But the fact that we are all here now, together in this room with one another, means we have a shared commitment to the political principles of equality, academic freedom, intellectual inquiry, and justice for all people, a commitment that is virtually unrivaled by any other campus. I'm extremely pleased to be here today, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and learning from what they have to say. And I'm going to turn it over now to David Matz and Rajni Shrikant. Layla, unfortunately, could not be here today. She's having a family crisis, actually. So it's really sad that she can't go. Rajni is going to take her place. But I think David Matz is up first. Is that correct? Yes, great. Super. Thanks.
Oh, isn't it up?
Well, because the thing kind of links up through one.
So what I've been asked to do is to give a little bit of a history background on the conflict, not on the boycott issue. This will be a context for folks to then jump in on that issue. So, as you all know, in telling a history story, everything depends on where you start. I start in 1880. 1880 in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, tremendous turmoil, hostility toward Jews, murder, rape, various kinds of discrimination. Many Jews leave. They go to the United States, that's how I got here, but they go many different places, and many of them decided that the only safe place for Jews would be their own place. Not called yet a state, but a place, and headed for the biblical land, went toward what was then called Palestine. They went there because it was from the Bible, and it gave them a sense of security. And they also went there because they believed there was nobody there. And they believed that for quite a while, despite the fact that it was, of course, factually not true. There were many Arabs living there. And so there's an interesting piece of literature, body of literature, about what it meant to say there was nobody there. From 1880 to 1948, Jews increased in the Palestine, and in 1948 declared the State of Israel. There had been a war, there had been a good deal of violence. Arabs had been very upset about the arrival of Jews in that region. And it became, with the Declaration of Independence, referred to by the Palestinians as the disaster, the Nakba, there was a full-fledged war. The war ended, and the reason this map is up here is so that I can show that when the map ended, 49, this was the white area, was Israel. This area was not. This area with labeled Palestine in this map was not common. This was the truce line. This is simply where the war ended. It had no more logic than where truce lines ever go. This was Israel for the 1949, 48 to 1967. 1967, another war. There are actually several intervening wars. Big contest over how that war started, but the result of it was that Israel took over this land, chunk of the Sinai, part of Syria. But what happened, for the purpose of today's conversation that was most important, was that into this area began to be built what are called today settlements, that is to say, towns and cities, populated by Jews from Israel, with three justifications. One was religious, This is biblical land. There are references in the Bible to Jews being here, Abraham buried here, etc. Security. This doesn't give much of a good scale, but Israel looked and said, we are surrounded by hostile Arabs. We need more space in order to defend ourselves. So there was a security argument for holding on to that land. And there was an economic argument. Many Jews moved there because the government gave very good deals in mortgages, tax breaks, and land prices. So there were three different justifications, as there are today. 1969, the first settlers moved there. Today, there are 370,000 Jews living here. I'm not counting Jerusalem, separate kind of problem. So 370,000 Jews, about 2.5 million Palestinians in the same area. That's the crucial ratio, about 370,000 Jews, 2.5 million Palestinians. That leads to, or is pardon me, I left out a group. There's also an undefined group of Israeli soldiers in here protecting the settlers in a situation that's very tense, very hostile, very difficult. It's important that there is no published record of how many soldiers there are. But if you go there, they're all over. It's perfectly clear there's a lot of military presence. If you're Palestinian, it is very hard to live here. Travel is difficult. Importing goods for economic development is difficult. None of these things are impossible. Travel does occur. And in fact, it's better today than it was 7 years ago. Travel within Palestine. Traveling into Israel is even harder. And movement is difficult. Importing things are difficult. Education is actually fairly thriving. One of the statements says that there's an oppression. That's a much more complicated thing. Basically, the schools do teach what they want to teach and use textbooks that they have written. So that's one of the places where I think some of the documents have a problem. One of the results of this is that many Palestinian parents are, in one way or another, suggesting to their children that living here long-term is not a good idea. This oppression has gone on for a long time. As we can see from the front pages, there's no obvious way in which it's going to end in any soon. So if you're a parent looking at your teenage kid, wondering, is it better that the kid grow up here and develop here or get out? And if you have the options either for financial reasons, linguistic reasons, family reasons, that's a good idea. And many parents make that choice. Last couple of comments. The Israeli government is today dominated by the Israeli right wing, which has got a lot of settler influence. That's true in the courts, it's true in the legislature, it's true in the executive wing, it's true in some increasing ways within the army. So that the Israelis vote regularly for 10 years, we want a two-state solution. 65, 70% of Israelis vote for it. The government goes in the opposite direction. That's important. On the Palestinian side, there is also a split, as I'm sure we're aware from reading the front pages. Over here is Gaza. Hamas, which is an Islamic group whose charter says no Jews can live here into the sea. That's explicit. It cites the Quran as a source. Here, Fatah, the political party for the Palestinians on the West Bank, has agreed, is largely a secular organization, and has agreed that they should be making peace with Israel. So you have a split within the Palestinians, you have a split within the Israelis. I point that out because although the newspapers make much of the Israeli-Palestinian contest, which is serious, I think more serious is the fight within each side. And that fight is sometimes violent, sometimes political, but those battles are the serious battles. And when we're thinking about boycotts or being effective in any way, I think we should be thinking about those. Okay, thanks.
Hi everybody, thank you for being here. Clearly I'm not like now. And I also don't profess to have the expertise politically or historically in this area. What I am going to do is actually project for you 3 primary documents or excerpts from primary documents so that you're all looking at the same text or considering the same text as we hear the panelists who are going to come up. So the first of these documents is an excerpt from the Palestinian civil society call for a boycott, divestment, sanction campaign. It was a call issued in 2005, and I will project an excerpt of that. The second excerpt is of a statement from David Hirsch, who some of you might know is a professor at the University of London, who runs a magazine and website called Engage, which is opposed to any kind of boycott campaign against Israel. And so it's an excerpt of his statement critiquing the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the third document is an excerpt of the document that brought us here, which is the American Studies Association resolution on the academic boycott of Israel. And each of these documents, or excerpts of documents, is only going to take up one PowerPoint slide because I want you to be able to absorb and process. But we do have hard copies of all of these excerpts in the back for you to refresh your memory at any point during the panelist's remarks. So if you will bear with me for 1 second while I call up the slides, that would be really helpful. See that? Is that visible, or do you want me to read it out? I'm happy to do that. Can you read it? Do you want me to read it out? Sure. Okay. So this is the excerpt from the 2005 call by Palestinian Civil Society for a boycott, divestment, sanctions, or what is more popularly known as BDS campaign. Given that all forms of international intervention and peacemaking have until now failed to convince or force Israel to respect fundamental human rights and to end its occupation and oppression of the people of Palestine, we, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. These nonviolent, punitive measures should be maintained until Israel meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law by 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. The next slide is a critique of the BDS campaign and excerpts of David Hirsch's statement. BDS relies on a false and simplistic premise that Israel is like the racists in apartheid South Africa, and Palestine is like the black people in South Africa. The logic of the BDS argument is that Israel is uniquely illegitimate in the world. BDS damages the Israeli peace movement and the Israeli left. It bolsters the claim of the Israeli right that the whole world is against Israel, whatever it does. It singles out Israeli cultural producers and academics for punishment not meted out to anyone else on the planet. We need a consistent policy with regards to human rights abuses around the world, not one that picks out Israeli Jews for unique sanction. Israel is a plural society. Anti-Arab racism is a serious problem in Israel. There are racist individuals, parties, and institutions. But there is a struggle in Israel over this. In Israel, as in other countries, there is a struggle against racism. Israeli universities are anti-racist institutions that create spaces where anti-racism is taught and practiced. The artistic and cultural spheres are also spaces where anti-racism is the norm. And the last primary document is the excerpt of the American Studies Association resolution on the academic boycott of Israel. And this was a resolution that was adopted in December 2013. Whereas there is no effective or substantive academic freedom for Palestinian students and scholars under conditions of Israeli occupation, and Israeli institutions of higher learning are a party to Israeli state policies that violate human rights and negatively impact the working conditions of Palestinian scholars and students. Whereas the American Studies Association is dedicated to the right of students and scholars to pursue education and research without undue state interference, repression, and military violence, and in keeping with the spirit of its previous statements, supports the right of students and scholars to intellectual freedom and to political dissent as citizens and scholars. It is resolved that the American Studies Association endorses and will honor the call of Palestinian civil society for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Thank you.
Okay, super. We also have the copies of the statements. I'm not going to pass them out. I'll leave them on the back table.
Do you have the handout of the second one? It looks like 3 of them and 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll get it for you. Everything that, if you're missing anything, it's all on the back table. Raise your hand, I'll bring it to you. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Darren Q, Professor of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance.
I think it's distinctly indicative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you would ask someone who studies Nigeria to moderate this panel. But in a way, I think it's actually quite appropriate because in Nigeria, a lot of my friends that I work with there, I work on the Muslim-Christian divide on efforts to try to bridge that conflict, talk about how closely Israeli-Palestinian politics are followed in Nigeria. Some of the neighborhoods in Kaduna actually have names like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And in particular, one of the individuals that I work with talks about how when Israelis and Palestinians sneeze, Nigerians catch a cold. And I think that's just indicative of how closely this conflict is followed all around the world. It's really hard to find a conflict. Those of us who study places like Nigeria look with jealousy sometimes at how much attention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict gets from the rest of the world. But I think the peculiar danger we face is that I think all of us walk in here with some pretty fixed opinions about what's happening there. And I was tasked very much with not to moderate a debate, but rather to try to stimulate a conversation today. So I'm going to ask to start by asking all of you to try to step back a bit, and including myself, from some of the opinions we hold about what's going on, and try to listen to what we're going to hear from these folks. And then after we hear from the 4 panelists, I'm going to ask you to talk to each other for a few minutes and to formulate some questions for the panelists so that we can hear from you some clarifying questions. And we're going to end with one question before we hear from the provost as to whether you'd like to see this conversation continue here on campus. Do you think things should go on? And then the organizers can then think about that from there in terms of next steps. So that's sort of what we're doing from here on in. So what I'd like to do for format is I'm going to give each of the panelists 10 minutes to state their perspective. And then I'm going to follow up with a quick clarifying question and give them 60 seconds to respond. And then we're going to move to the next person. And my clarifying questions will be exactly that, to try to bring out particular elements of what they're saying. in particular to sort of steer our conversation towards the goals of the meeting today. So you've heard from, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to maybe start with a 20-second introduction of themselves when I turn to them, so that who can do better than that to do so. And then we get started. So if I can turn to Rachel, who will start us off. Do you want to come up here? Do you want to stay there? There's no mic. Oh, yeah, then you better come up.
We did have
Oh, no.
mics. They're on.
Here they are. You want to stay there?
Rachel,
Yeah.
it's on. Is it on?
Yeah,
Wait,
I think so.
Okay, now give it 2 seconds.
Now try.
Now, yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Rubin, and I'm in the American Studies Department, and I am a member of the American Studies Association. I voted in favor of the boycott resolution. And I would like to start by saying how lucky I feel to be here today, and how lucky I am to be here today with all of you. And I do mean all of you. Some of my favorite people at UMass Boston have found themselves on both sides of this issue, and I have found it very useful to talk to all of them. Most of the people I have talked to who oppose the boycott do it for really good, noble reasons. They fear that an academic boycott of Israeli universities threatens academic freedom, which is a scary thought. So I'm going to start by responding to that in as straightforward a way as possible. There is no such thing as academic freedom. The key word there is thing. Academic freedom is not a product, it's a process. We have to work for it all the time. We do work for it all the time. We have to judge each situation. We must ponder each fork in the road. We must craft our response to each historical call. We have to use all the tools we are lucky enough to have, and that UMass Boston collectively is lucky enough to have, to work constantly toward that ideal. In fact, it's one of the things academia is for, to sift through all the different kinds of evidence that we take up as our daily business in our different fields, and move toward that ideal in the sky where clouds spell out the words academic freedom. In other words, a simple-minded, static, one-size-fits-all defensive academic freedom is not the sturdy resolution some of my colleagues treat it as. It simply privileges the rights of the already privileged rather than foregrounding a network of vulnerabilities and complicities and responsibilities. You might as well criticize a professor who refuses to enter a burning building to teach a class of challenging academic freedom. Friends, I don't think anyone who is following the issue of the American Studies Association boycott resolution, the coverage of it internationally, the out-of-proportion response, the punitive legislative measures introduced to punish universities who didn't cancel their ASA memberships, can deny that Israel-Palestine has become a burning building. And the smoke is in our eyes. Here at UMass Boston, we know, we wait around every year to see what our funding will be like. We at UMass Boston know that academics don't soar above the political realm, unanchored by the material realities of the lives of ourselves, of our students, of the authors of the books we teach, of the subjects of the books we teach, the goals of the experiments we do, the people or societies we hope will benefit from the hard work we do every day. In other words, we don't have an ivory tower. Our budget won't cover it. Well, Israel doesn't have an ivory tower either. It has, like us, a substructure that once held great promise, that dishonest contractors betrayed, and that is now cracked and dangerous. Among these cracks is the virtual absence of academic freedom for scholars and students at Palestinian universities. Our colleagues there are subject to the refusal of permission to travel abroad, something the United States used to criticize the Soviet Union for doing to Soviet Jews. In fact, several Fulbright scholars were denied exit visas pretty much exactly right after the ASA vote. They are denied the right of a freedom assembly that we take for granted. Look at us now. This couldn't happen at a Palestinian university. They suffer from physical assaults on students by settlers in the occupied territory. They face sustained discrimination at Israeli universities against admission of Palestinians. Our colleagues in Israel-Palestine daily confront the ongoing repression of political activity on Israeli campuses, perceived as anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian, and chillingly echoed in Northeastern University's recent suspension that Heike mentioned of a student group, essentially for leafleting. Drawing criticism, I might add, even from right-wing Zionist Harvey Silverglade. You know you've gone too far. These universities collaborate in military intelligence research that enables the occupation. They carry out the construction of campuses and dormitories in violation of international law in occupied Palestinian territory. They confront direct and intentional attacks on intellectual freedom through the Nakba Law, which legislates the withdrawal of state funding from any university that commemorates the Palestinian Day of Mourning, along with the Boycott Law, which punishes any groups or individuals who advocate boycotting Israeli products or institutions. Do you like that built-in contradiction? We need to rephrase the old bumper sticker about capital punishment so that we have one that says, why boycott institutions that boycott institutions, to show that boycotting institutions is wrong. The late graphic novelist Harvey Pekar, in the title of his latest work, put it far better and more efficiently than I ever could. His book is wonderful, and you should all read it. It's called Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me. In hallway conversations here on campus and at the American Studies Association meeting itself, the second question people have asked me is, why single out Israel? That question contains its own answer. The American Studies Association is a small, powerless organization of professors. We're not even big enough for the New York Times to make fun of every year the way it does the MLA. I'm proud of American studies, of my field, which in the 1940s and 1950s offered a welcoming home to Jewish professors who were not welcome in English or history departments. Sorry, I'm a historian, I have to go there. American Studies has a history of working for academic freedom, which I believe the boycott does. But why did we light such a spark by doing so? Because criticizing Israel is perceived as different from criticizing other countries with human rights violations. Because we are not the ones who have singled out Israel. If we were, no one would especially care if an organization of 4,000 college professors passed a short boycott resolution. But we did pass it, and people have asked me why. How do I answer? By invoking the UMass Boston motto of sorts that our chancellor frequently recites. We are a research institution with a teaching soul. I think you can count on us, that all of us in the American Studies Association who voted for the resolution have done our homework. I think you could say that we like to read. I think you could say that leading up to the vote and after, some of us became what might be called obsessive, or insomniac, or haunted. And then having done this research, those of us here at UMass Boston felt a kick in the ass from our teaching soul. And we responded with a great teaching moment, the boycott resolution, which is, after all, a rhetorical gesture, what linguists call a speech act, a collectively powerful one. The fact that we are all here together today proves that it is working. In fact, it's working so well that it taught me something about my own experience nearly 30 years ago, when I learned a lot from spending a month sleeping on the steps of a Columbia University building whose doors my classmates and I had changed shut as part of a call for our university to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. I was a hyper-responsible student, and I felt great trepidation when I approached just one of my 5 professors that semester and asked for an extension on the final paper because the divestment work had put me behind. The professor told me to take my time, or even not to write it. You've done so much knowledge production already at the blockade, he said. I wrote the paper on Moby Dick, But our gathering today has helped me to understand what he meant. The boycott resolution has not hindered the educational process anywhere. The boycott resolution is the engine of an important educational process worldwide. My grandfather, Mendel Rubin, was born in about 1880 and came to the United States with his family in about 1908. He was a pushcart vendor, selling fruits and vegetables in the squalid tenement neighborhood where they lived in a basement. Over the years, he managed to save up enough money to buy a little piece of land in what is now Israel. It was really cheap. It was really cheap then because there was no country of Israel. He had a vision of escaping the ghetto, both the one in Bielorussia and the one here in New York, to a place where he could work the land, he could grow vegetables instead of walking city streets for 12 hours a day selling them. I just learned of that land this year when an Israeli real estate lawyer contacted me and my many cousins about it. I've been thinking and thinking about where that land is now. My grandfather wanted to get out of the slum, not put Palestinians into one. I promise all of you that I will be donating every cent of that money. It is what he and my civil rights organizer father would have wanted. Thank you.
Rachel, a quick follow-up question for 60 seconds. I want to push you on the point that you were starting on where you mentioned about how the boycott is part of an educational process. One thing I don't think we heard was clear from you is how do you see the boycott improving freedom, academic freedom for Palestinians? What's the flow of logic there? The boycott does what, which then improves academic freedom for Palestinians?
The boycott resolution, as I said, is a very powerful rhetorical gesture. The attention it is getting is what is going to help change the tide. I would say the world opinion, it has changed. Change the sort of carte blanche pass that the Israeli government has gotten vis-a-vis its own educational institutions and Palestinian ones. And that kind of pressure is extremely effective, history teaches us, in bringing about change.
Thank you very much. Turn now to Dave Living.
Thank you, folks. Thanks again, for inviting us here. Yeah, it might be useful. And it's on, you can hear me? There's a button. Buttons always help. Okay, so I'm David Levy in the College of Management here, but a long, long time ago in a land far, far away, I was a very different person. I was a undergrad student at Manchester University at a time when there was the strong anti-apartheid movement, and so there was, in the UK, a no platform for racist policies. And then campus by campus in the UK, they were passing a Zionism is racism debate or a motion in debates in halls like this. And the effect of that was to ban Jewish societies that were partly cultural, partly religious, and they had an aspect that was a cultural piece that was supportive of Israel for some people. But the effect was to defund and ban any Jewish society activities on campus. Now, I was a young Jewish person, not so Zionist really, but had been exposed to anti-Semitism as a kid, been beaten up, been chased. And the impact of these debates was on myself, to make myself much more of an active Zionist, ended up going to live in Israel. But it also poisoned the campus, and I think this is something very important. This isn't just something happening 5,000 miles away. The impact of these acrimonious debates about whether Zionism is racism and should the Jewish societies be banned created such rancor on campus that it created hostility. Any connections that the Jewish left had with Palestinian groups on campus came to an end. It ended dialogue, it ended discussion and education. What I appreciate here is we don't have a motion on the table, because if it did, it would be a very different debate. It wouldn't be educational, it would be confrontational. And those were the debates that we endured in Britain during those years. I went on a long journey from there. I spent 7 years in Israel. I had 3 months in the army. I've collected now 3 passports from around the world, consider myself a citizen of the world. Became very disillusioned with Israel, with their treatment of Palestinians, came to the conclusion it wasn't worth our while paying the economic price. We were no longer willing to support the state, and with our son, didn't want him to go into the army after that. And we left. My wife, the radical feminist, came to the conclusion it was a state for Jewish men and not for Jewish women. So, you know, for various reasons, we ended up leaving after about 6 or 7 years there and came here to the US. So here I am, you know, I'm an Israeli national amongst other things. Should I be boycotted? How do we apply this? This will be one of the themes we get to. One very important point, though, about the wider boycott, not just the academic boycott, is that the academic literature I've seen about the about the broader economic boycott of South Africa really questions its effectiveness. The consensus seems to be that apartheid was brought down primarily due to internal factors, internal organizing, strikes, and the economic boycott was relatively ineffective. One reason is it was designed to be ineffective because it was designed so that Western multinationals wouldn't suffer too much, so that they could continue their trade via other means. The other main factor was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the US no longer needed a so-called bulwark against communism in Africa, and the whites in South Africa no longer feared that it would become a satellite of the Soviet Union. So those factors helped to bring it down. Now, I'm not going to touch on apartheid Israel versus South Africa. That's sort of much bigger debate. We could have another week on that, so we're not going to get into that here. But more narrowly on the academic freedom debate and intellectual freedom, as I was reading some of the materials here, I was really struck that, like Rachel, a lot of people were saying, hey, look, there's repression of the Israeli left in universities, there's repression of the Palestinian universities. So if academic freedom is under threat, we shouldn't be worried about imposing a boycott because that would somehow be hypocritical. I just see that as a total non sequitur. If academic freedom and the left are under threat in Israel, then we should do everything that we can to support progressive voices, voices for coexistence, and encourage those linkages and encourage those voices. You might have seen in just yesterday and today, J Street, a progressive Jewish organization in the US, is looking for membership in the larger Jewish community, and that sparked a big debate. And there is a sense in which I think we need to encourage those voices wherever they are, the progressive voices looking for coexistence, and not try and shut them down. There really has been a lot of repression in Israel, particularly of Ben Gurion University. I know somebody who was expelled from the political science department there of Haifa University. We certainly don't deny that, but that's not a reason to impose a boycott. Again, going back to the South African context, this author and academic Marjorie Hines was saying, and quoting a South African scholar, Hislop, that scholars around the world who wanted to support the explosion of critical scholarship, cultural production and activism that the revolutionary times had produced in South African campuses couldn't do so if they were required to observe a blanket academic boycott. And the African National Congress itself began to understand that political developments on South African campuses were worth encouraging and that international links might contribute to this. So part of the core argument seems to be whether universities are part of the state apparatus of repression. And Joe Scott, in one of the pieces, that seems to be the central plank. These are part of the state apparatus of repression, therefore we should boycott them. I would suggest that the universities in Israel are actually the most integrated of institutions. Still a lot of problems, a lot of racism, but they are more integrated than many other institutions there. And there's a lot of collaboration with Palestinian Authority, Palestinian civil society, and with other countries, particularly with Israel and Egypt on the academic level. And I've got some associations with the Aravar Institute that's part of Ben Gurion University, very, very committed to integrating Palestinian students and issues into the educational process there. I look towards Antonio Gramsci, the famous Italian Marxist, for inspiration here. And understanding that universities are part of civil society. As part of that, they are part of the extended state in some ways and help to shore up the hegemony in Israel. At the same time, they're contested. And the universities are very much contested terrain. And I think it's our duty to do what we can to encourage the more progressive forces rather than impose a blanket boycott. A question here is, who gets targeted? Most of the boycotts that have been suggested imply some kind of ideological test, and that really smacks of McCarthyism. It becomes very, very dangerous if, as in the British boycott, that was the British Association of University Teachers that passed in 2005, they start making exceptions for people who they consider to be anti-Zionist or pass some undefined test. You're okay, you support a two-state solution, or maybe it's only okay if you support a one-state solution. You know, where do we draw these lines? Who's okay to talk, who isn't okay to talk? It's a very, very slippery slope here, and there have certainly been some cases where there was this woman, Mona Baker, at UMass, which was actually my undergraduate part of Manchester, sacked a couple of Israelis from positions on journal boards just because of their Israeli nationality, even though one of them was very firm leftist. It's a form of collective punishment, and as it's applied, or it gets very, very tricky as we try to decide who it's okay to boycott and who isn't. So the effectiveness of a boycott, I agree it's primarily symbolic, but it's a very powerful symbolic weapon in some ways. And it can push people to the right, it polarizes. I met a couple of academic people here at UMass who felt it would create a hostile environment for them here. And I don't think that's something that we want on campus. I think it's very important to understand that a core issue, a core problem as I see it in Israel, is the collective sense of victimhood. And that's not just in Israel, I think it's amongst the Jewish communities here. We draw a straight line from Haman to the Romans, the Inquisition, to Hitler, to Hamas. Everybody wants to kill us, they always did. And we can joke about it, but that's so deep in our identity, in our liturgy, in the culture. And a boycott movement only supports that. And it makes people feel even more defensive. It generates what we call a Masada complex, right? We close the walls and we won't listen. My own personal journey to opposing the occupation didn't take that route. It wasn't under pressure, it wasn't under punitive measures. And what has become much more effective, one of the things I'm most proud of, is bringing Israeli officers who refused to serve in the occupation, the courage to refuse people, to the Boston area, and founded an organization that supported Israeli refusers. And we packed out Temple Israel with 1,000 Jews who wouldn't have listened to anybody else. They would never have gone to a Palestinian to hear them. And I think it helped to shift perspective, to open the space for J Street. The bringing in the Israeli left, engaging with them, is one avenue to shift thinking here in ways which other boycotts don't. I just came back from Havana. They've had 30 years of a boycott. It hasn't shifted people's views very much there at all. If anything, it locks them into it. Boycotts, in general, like that, aren't particularly effective. We need top-down political courage. I wish President Obama had a bit more courage to push from the top. But we also need the bottom-up work of engaging in civil society. And I think as a university, there's a lot that we can do on that side. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'd like to push you a bit on the apartheid example. I think we don't want to debate apartheid here, but I think it's important we note that there is a great debate about the effectiveness of sanctions and the effectiveness of boycotts. Politicians, for instance, at the time argued that it was an essential piece of delegitimizing the apartheid state. And at the time, there were a lot of white South Africans who were arguing, saying, look, the boycotts are important, and even though we are going to suffer, we see that the situation is so bad now, that's not going to make anything worse for us. Please go ahead and impose these sorts of sanctions. Are you hearing any such voices among the Israeli left right now, where the very progressives you were talking about are actually saying, please do the boycott because it'll help empower us in some way? How does that complicate matters?
Yeah, it does complicate it in general. The Israeli left, and particularly intellectuals and authors, and I tend to take my lead from them, I suppose, and seeing what they write. For example, David Grossman, Alphabet Yehoshua, Amos Oz, in 2010 did call for a cultural boycott of the West Bank, and particularly of Ariel University. They won't perform there. A good friend of mine as well, who's a doctoral student now, professor in Israel, supports that boycott of institutions over the Green Line. That's problematic, you know, but it is hard to have absolutist positions here. Boycotts are political tools. They raise awareness in some ways. But notice that that is targeted toward the occupation rather than the existence of the state itself. And I think when the boycott is seen as an existential threat, it tends to shut people down. So there is an organized movement. They are seen as extreme within Israel, but perhaps I think there's at least more debate in Israel than there is allowed perhaps in the Jewish community in the US. So there are some things we need to change there.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn to Paul, please.
I'm Paul Watson. I'm in the Social Science Department Director of the Institute for Asian American Studies. The thought that comes to my mind initially is General John Stockwell was the vice presidential candidate for Ross Perot, as you might remember. And in the midst of a vice presidential debate, he said, "Why am I here? What am I doing?" So in some ways, thoughts are shared by me. Why am I here? What am I doing? Perhaps the organizers thought that here's a guy who was born in a place that calls itself Zion, next to a river that's called Jordan, and refers to outsiders as Gentiles. Unfortunately, it wasn't the Promised Land, it was Utah. And so that's where I came from. So that's my thread for being part of this particular discussion. So you can imagine with that background and with these distinguished people, not only up here but in the room, it's intimidating, the fact that to be in a situation where you know everybody knows more than you do about what you've been asked to talk about. And I must say I was about at a loss about 24 hours ago about really what to say. And then I got a message, and the message came from the chairman of a New England chapter of a major national organization. And he sent me a message and said, "I heard about this forum at UMass Boston, and I wanted to send you some things." And there were two articles that he had written, one in the Boston Herald, which focused on his analysis opposition to the American Studies resolution, and then secondly, a piece in the Jerusalem Post that he had written talking about the MLA discussion and the controversy around the Modern Languages Association. So of course, I felt a need to respond to these emails that I received. And so this exchange began at about 4 o'clock and ended at about midnight. And in some ways, it prepared me, it gave me something to talk about for you today. Not in an elegant form, as in the words that people have if you do emails. Emails allow you to say something very direct, not necessarily elegantly. And I did so, and I'm sort of going to quote a lot from my own emails. So that's really where I sort of came around to these particular issues. And the messages that were sent to me focused on, as I said, the American Studies resolution. And my responses began, and I began my response just as actually Heike began this forum, and I hate to be repetitive, but I wanted to do this. I started my remarks by telling him why UMass Boston was having this forum today itself. And I wrote, some of us, ironically, in the spirit of your arguments, he's complaining about the allegations about the MLA misconduct in the way in which the boycott supporters treated this issue. Some of us, ironically, in the spirit of your arguments, felt that this allegedly one-sided decision-making on the American Studies action by the MLA was not proper. So some people asked that there be not proper, and this is at UMass Boston, sorry. Some of us, ironically, in the spirit of some of your arguments, felt that this allegedly one-sided decision-making on the American Studies action was not proper at UMass Boston. So some people asked that there be an opportunity for the campus to examine the issue of academic boycotts and to do so by inviting boycott proponents and opponents to be equally represented in a campus discussion. To his great credit, the Chancellor agreed to have this discussion in this forum with that equal representation of viewpoints. I think, and I hope you agree, that this is a good way for campuses to deal with these kinds of complex, troubling, contentious, and important matters. And I point out, as Heike did, that the Chancellor is one of dozens of university leaders and presidents who condemned the American Studies action. To my knowledge, he stands alone in supporting a forum like this. And in some ways it's uncomfortable for me. It's uncomfortable, I'm sure, for our Chancellor to sit here as being a part of this discussion. It's uncomfortable for me, who's a friend of the Chancellor and usually on the same side of most issues with him. But I applaud the fact that he is in fact open himself and all of us up to having this uncomfortable conversation. Now, one of the questions that was directed at me in these exchanges, and it's one that's very much behind this, is why target Israel and not its neighbors? This is a fundamental question that's raised time and time again when we talk about the academic boycott. Here in part is my answer. You ask why target Israel. You answer your own question in this fashion. Quote, this is what he wrote in his article. The boycotters deny that their targeting of Israel, whose credentials as a democracy are unrivaled in the Middle East, is the product of bigotry, unquote. According to this formulation, since I am a boycott supporter, I wrote, I must be a bigot. And if I thought otherwise, I'm in denial. My partial answer to why Israel lies in part, however, in the other part of your statement, quote, Israel, whose credentials as a democracy are unrivaled in the Middle East, unquote. If Israel aspires and claims to be unlike the other states that you point out, it should reflect not only in words, but also in actions, its commitment to democracy and human rights and decency and respect. In other words, to live up to those allegedly, quote, unrivaled credentials. At least for me, my support of the academic boycott is not because I hate Israel. It's because I take you and others with a passionate commitment and belief in Israel at your word. But he responded by saying, however, silence on Israel's neighbors, which cannot hold a candle to Israel and human rights while targeting Israel, to me, it is morally indefensible. And here is my response. You are correct to some extent that little attention is paid to Israel's neighbors. The United States fully and staunchly, with political, diplomatic, and financial support, $10 million a day, by the way, $10 million a day of financial support, stands with Israel and not Israel's neighbors. American public opinion overwhelmingly stands with Israel and not its neighbors. Israel's military strength, conventional and nuclear, is greater than its neighbors. America's political, cultural, economic, and educational leadership stands overwhelmingly with Israel and not its neighbors. In short, Israel is powerful, and its supporters are powerful as well. It is not unreasonable, in my view, to hold the powerful to a high standard, because what that power means is that the reach of their ability to do harm and to do good, as you point out, are greater than those who are weak. Indeed, boycotts as a means of support for Israel's neighbors are a reflection of the power disparity. Tactics like boycotts are probably no match for the real power that Israel possesses. I have little doubt as well that, at least in this country, another reflection of the power of Israel and its supporters is that the boycott supporters will be effectively dismissed and labeled and derided. Power means that one gets to ask the questions and provide the answers. And let me make a final point, and I may not take my entire time. I thought initially when we had this forum that it was possible and wise to try and compartmentalize our discussions, to have a discussion of the realities on the ground in Israel and Palestine, to talk about the academic boycott, and then to talk about the response to that movement. And I realize now, through this experience, that they are, in fact, all connected and revealing. And it is not wise or possible to separate these into these individual pieces. The effect of my experience has given me new meaning to the BDS role. In fact, I thought of BDS as something different, as a bird dog strategy to some extent. A bird dog flushes out the tactics and enormous resources of some who oppose the academic boycott and its supporters. This is what the resolution has done. It has flushed out the tactics of those who oppose the academic boycott and its supporters. A goal of the boycott, as has been pointed out by Rachel, is to expand literacy and discourse. It has both contested and exposed and flushed out the forces of those who are imposing those constraints. And those constraints have included legislation, as has been pointed out, in states and at the federal level, to cut funding to professors and the programs to support these ideas. And if you think this is just generally directed, as one legislator in New York was pointing out, they said, well, that might mean that people who criticize other states other than Israel might be subject to these sorts of things, or boycott measures. He says, that's ridiculous. We're not talking about North Korea and Cuba here. We're talking about people who criticize Israel. So in some ways, he's very clear about what he believes is the target of these various sorts of measures. And this silence and threatening, I was at a conference last week in San Francisco on a panel, and I listened during the question and answer period, not in the presentation, a young professor from Rutgers University who said in her department she felt intimidated to even speak out on the issue of the academic boycott, worried about how senior members of her department were going to treat her in terms of her success within that particular department. In me, that's going beyond the line. That is not only robbing people of their words, it's robbing them of their lunch, of their livelihood. That's the extremes to which, to some degree, the constraints that are being imposed. And of course, there's name calling and labeling are relentless. Let me end by saying this. The question for us is how to answer the call. And remember what the call is about. The call is to address the rights and living conditions of Palestinians under Israeli control. The call is to address the expansion of the colonization of Israel in the occupied lands. And the call is to address the question of the return of Palestinian refugees. That's what the call is about. And it's a call that was addressed to organizations, but it's not only addressed to organizations. I hope you read it. It's addressed to people of conscience. Now, I am mindful that it may be a modest expression, a weak expression. I'm kind of a cynic about war and things like that. The words of Locke always ring in my head about the weak hands of justice in this world. So I'm a realist about knowing about some of the weakness that goes going against individual power that is armed to the extent to which the support for Israel and the United States support of it is manifested. But my answer, and this is really all I can talk about and claim, is my answer to the call is that I must, as a person of conscience, embrace it. And that embrace, to answer the question of this forum, is justified. Thank you.
If I can just push you real quickly to close the loop on the end of your argument here. Both you and Rachel, I think, noted very importantly the importance of the boycott for trying to open up the closing space within the United States to talk about these issues. Could you take us through the logic from there back to Israel? So opening the academic freedom space here in the United States, will this then lead to greater pressure on American foreign policy, which will then change the power dynamics in Israel you were talking about? How does the boycott link back to impacting what's happening within Israel-Palestine?
I was just going to say yes to what you just said. To me, the thing that I can focus upon and the thing that I think is important about this is ways in which we can influence American support and policy towards Israel. And part of that, I think, is to break the monopoly on the discussion of discourse about Israel, and not just about Israel, about the United States' support for Israel to the extent that it exists. You know, 20% of every foreign aid dollar that the United States gives is given to one country, Israel. $121 billion have been given to Israel since the end of World War, since the creation of the State of Israel. You know, that, in some ways, there's complicity in that involvement. So part of what I'm arguing is it's not only the complicity of this abstraction called the United States of America, it's a complicity of myself and everybody in this room who fills out a 1040 form and mails it in on August 15th. And I did mail mine in, I didn't send electronically. Who mails it in on August 15th. April 15th, sorry. April 15th. And to me, that is a way, a small way, a modest way, possibly, given my calculation of power, a weak way for us to try to change the movement far away in a land called Israel.
Thank you. Gonzalo? Oh.
If Paul didn't know why he was invited, in all honesty, I was surprised. And I think that...
say it's yourself.
Oh, yes, so I'm Gonzalo Basigalupe, and I'm a professor in the Canton School Psych department, and I'm a family therapist and health researcher. And I wrote also, I was delinquent because I wrote a long email to Heike when she invited me to sign the letter. And I immediately thought, I'm not going to sign this letter, and not because I think that Israel is non-delinquent. I do actually speak out against Israel policies. That's not the issue for me. So I'm going to try to be very brief, and I did not prepare long remarks, thinking that I asked to be the last one. I'm a therapist, so I wanted to listen and then to react. But I have some ideas that I think that I hope to get across with, and then later on I'll probably prepare some remarks on these to you. So the first thing is to say that whenever one wants to talk about this, the dialogue really gets stiffened and very polarized. And in a way, I accepted the invitation to come here because I thought that it would be helpful to have this sort of dialogue that the panelists have actually shared. I'm agreeing with the three of them in many ways. Particularly, I think that we tend to confuse, the politics with the tactics. So I'm Chilean, and I also have 3 citizenships myself, and I'm playing the Swiss here. I'm Swiss. And as a Chilean, Chile actually is the country with the largest Palestinian and Palestinian descent group in the world, outside Palestinian. So for me, Palestinians were just brothers and sisters, classmates. It's not, a foreign, distant place. But one of the things I wrote in that letter was that I really disagree with these sort of academic boycotts, because I think that it impacts the fight within the place where repression and authoritarian issues are happening. And this is coming, from my own experience as someone who lived under a dictatorship most of my young adulthood, and who in a way saw repeatedly the negative effect of cultural and academic boycotts. And in some way, what I'm suggesting is that actually it's easier to boycott from a position of privilege than it is to engage productively from that same position of privilege. And let me give you an example. In 1987, sort of like at the edge of the end of the dictatorship in Chile, and we had from 1973 to 1988, 77 actors and academics were threatened with execution by the government. And at that time, Ariel Dorfman, an academic here in the United States, who is a Chilean and US citizen, called actors and academics to fly to Chile and protest. And Christopher Reeves, Superman, was one of the most recognized ones who went there. And it was the end of the academic cultural boycott to Chile, and it really made a huge difference in terms of supporting those who were fighting within. Somehow, boycotts tend to, and there's a lot of articles about this, to tend to reinforce the clash of absolutes, and in some way, to tend to think of just bipolar terms and not in a more, I would say, diverse way of thinking about it. So I do think I agree with the critiques of, that, we are about the free exchange of information ideas, while at the same time I do believe that we have our own authoritarian ways of speaking. In fact, I think that we should be boycotting the US government, not the Israeli government. In fact, we should be boycotting not the people of Israel when we do this kind of academic boycotts. Because really, the Israeli government gains a lot of energy out of these boycotts. They love it. Like Pinochet loved these boycotts because in some way it calls for nationalistic whatever inside the country. It doesn't help. And in some way it isolates and makes those of us who are within, even if we are the minority, to feel even more marginalized. Let me close by saying, and I'm reading something that was written by someone else, an indigenous Native American academic who says, let me close by saying that I think the best thing we academics can do is precisely the opposite of academic boycott. I truly believe that speaking truth to power is a fundamental concern of academia, and that sometimes the most effective place to do so is in the belly of the beast. Instead of carrying out conversations, we should nurture and build them. Instead of boycotting all Israeli universities, people who care deeply about this issue should look for ways to engage them. We should bring our information and ideas to them and share them. Instead of saying we won't go there or collaborate with them, let's get there and collaborate with them. Perhaps a conference on comparative colonialism or imperialism, perhaps a special issue on comparative indigenous studies. Let the sparks fly, let voices be raised, but better than that, silence. As academics, we are our best when we're engaging, sharing, writing, and discussing. And let me finish by saying that besides my academic work, I do a lot of work with Physicians for Human Rights, and I do forensic assessment of people who are refugees looking for asylum in the United States. And every time when I ask the question about, I actually ask the question about what do you think helps in the fight wherever your country comes, Central America or other places, it is engagement, it's not boycott. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David ended his remarks talking about the danger of the Masada complex that a boycott could put in Israel. As a therapist, would you comment maybe on the psychology of a boycott on folks in Israel or Palestine, either on this Masada complex, which is obviously it's a huge number of folks, but would you feel like commenting about what sort of psychological impacts a boycott might have on either or both populations in one way or the other?
No. I refuse to add psychopathology to any of these phenomena, either to what's happening to Palestinians or Israelis, and so I would say I don't want to add to that discourse.
Fair enough. Thank you. We're going to lose David Matz in a few minutes. David, I wanted to give you a second before you go. Did you want to have a parting shot?
Just one comment, and that is, for me, the fear of the American studies kind of thing is the slippery slope problem. It's not the document itself, it's where it can go. I agree with the comments made about the impact on academics, particularly left-wing academics, both Palestinian and Israeli. And the impact on them is, it's not strengthening, it's weakening. And I worry not so much about this statement, but the way it opens a door to other kinds of boycotts, other kinds of academic boycotts. I think academic boycotts are a different thing than commercial boycotts, for example, or sports and entertainment boycotts. And I think because of the kinds of things that were just said concerning the desire for us to engage, I think we should be strategizing engagements rather than strategizing disengagements.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to note that I'm going to ask Rajani and Heike to come up later and join the other group, so you'll have a chance as well on your opening comments if you'd like to engage this conversation. So as I mentioned, now I want to turn to you. And remember, our goal is a more limited one, not to come to some sort of conclusion today, but rather we're trying to decide whether to continue this conversation on campus. So I'd like you to break into clusters of maybe 3 or 4 folks, because we're not going to be able to take questions from everyone. But I think I'd like you to sort of work together to just sort of sift through a little bit of what you heard. And in these smaller clusters of 3 or 4, and if I can ask the Chancellor and Provost, because you guys talk together quite often, maybe. I'm in trouble. So if you could join different clusters, and clusters of 3 or 4, and ask yourself some, what you just heard, what are you thinking about, but can you come together for one question you would want to ask the panelists to further clarify this question of, do we need to continue this conversation here on campus? What more do you need to know from these folks in order to continue this conversation or not? Okay? So I want to take about 10 minutes if you could talk with each other, and can you come to a question that you'd like to ask the panelists? If I can ask the panelists to talk among themselves, now's a good chance for you to ask questions you learn from each other. Come on back. Okay, thank you, everyone. I can hear there are some really good conversations going on here. And one of the temptations after doing this is when I turn to each of you is to tell us about that entire conversation. And unfortunately, we only have 15 minutes left. So you may need to start with a prelude sentence or two to tell us about what was happening in your cluster. But if you could move to your question as soon as possible, I'm going to actually ask the panelists to write these down so that we can turn to you at the end to comment on each of these briefly. So I counted about 9 clusters out there. Self-appointed, would a member of each cluster want to sort of tell us your key priority question? Would you like to start us off? Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Can I ask everyone to please listen? Thank you very much. Please.
The question that we have is, what exactly does the boycott entail? Does it mean non-inviting scholars to conferences, non-inviting Israeli scholars and professors from Israel to serve as visiting professors? Does it mean not allowing the Israeli professors or academics to serve in an editorial capacity? What does that specifically entail?
Would you like to direct your question, or did you?
Any of them.
Okay, can I ask someone to take initial ownership for answering? You will? Okay, thank you. Okay, can I hear from another cluster? Or, sorry, did any of the other clusters have a similar question as this one that you would like to add, clarify, please? Same question? Did you want to?
We were being harassed. Could you repeat the question, because we couldn't hear it, because we're being harassed by somebody.
Sorry. Okay.
Could you repeat the question? We missed it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, you want to? Oh, sorry, repeat.
Oh, you want me to repeat it?
Yes,
Yeah, please.
I have a request to you.
Thanks.
Do I need to be with a mic? Is that-
No,
No,
it's
it's
not your fault.
What exactly does the boycott entail? Does it mean not inviting scholars or professors from Israel to serve as visiting professors? Does it mean not inviting professors or scholars to Israeli scholars or whatever to conferences? Or does it mean not inviting Israeli scholars and professors to serve in editorial capacity? What specifically does the boycott entail?
And your cluster had a very similar question. Would you like to clarify at all? Okay. Same that? Okay, any other clusters also, anyone to add on to this particular point? Okay, great. From any of the other clusters, want to tell us what you'd like? Yes, please, Benjamin.
So we asked, what is it that these conversations could or should accomplish? Right, so ultimately the question is that should we get together again? I mean, I don't want to be cynical at all. Why? Is it for intellectual interest? Is it for activism? Is it for engagement? Is it for curiosity? Like, what do we really hope to gain by these conversations?
Okay, question on next steps. Any other clusters have a similar question as that to add to or clarify,
So
please?
I think ours is a little bit similar. The question is really around what is it that constitutes academic freedoms, which could lead us towards a global community, towards a more successful debate and resolution of the sorts of issues that confront Palestinians and Israelis. And the question is, what sort of strategic arrangement does each side see happening, and what kind of strategic engagement do you see happening here in the United States that would support the kind of dialogue that you want to see, and what kind of strategic arrangements specifically, what sort of dialogues, who would be engaged in those dialogues, what kind of dialogues do you see happening in Israel that could be supported by continued funding to academic Israeli institutions, which would lead us closer to this?
So I heard an initial question on next steps here at UMass, and you've expanded it, I think, to next steps elsewhere as well. Should we break that into 2 questions? Do anybody want to, who would like to take the first crack at that? Each of you will speak, of course. I just want to make sure someone has the next steps on campus, and then the next steps. Yeah. Paul, you said yes? Or?
I will do the, what should we have more conversations?
Thank you. The second half, do you want to take?
By the strategic arrangements.
Thank you. Okay, good. From another cluster, we'd like to hear? Okay, we'll start here, and then there. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how representative it is of the cluster as a whole, because there's a lot of different things, but
We had an art cluster.
we had a cluster that we had dynamics in some ways. We ended up loving and in unity about our cluster identity, although not in any context. So I know it represents, okay? Some people in the cluster were very happy. I think all people of us were very happy that this is taking place. I think it's really appropriate and it serves a lot of good purposes. But some of us were disappointed in the level that it got to, because it focused in on this tactic of whether a particular boycott, the American Studies Association boycott, is going to be effective at expanding academic freedom in general, or in particular in Israel and Palestine, and whether it's going to be effective in opening up dialogue in the United States. Real questions, real interesting tactical questions. I don't think anyone has a tremendous amount of expertise, so it was nice to hear rhetorical speculation on that matter. But the real heat in this debate is what are actually the political goals involved? And everyone here shares one very abstract political goals. We want to see justice and the respect for human rights of all. But in this context, some people think that involves a recognition of Palestinian and Jewish national aspirations, and some people think Jewish national aspirations are illegitimate. That was never really dealt with, because if you have different goals, then it's silly to argue about the tactic, because the tactic is only judged morally. It's not only, it may have intrinsic properties that are problematic, but besides that, it's judged by the goal. Many people believe that BDS global movement, not necessarily individual aspects of it, essentially think that all of Israel is a colonial occupied land, and that any kind of state that defines itself in any way as Jewish, unlike a state that defines itself as Danish, is illegitimate. Until that's grasped with, it seems to me the real issue is avoided.
Okay, a question on political goals. This is somewhat strategic, but okay. I'm going to task it to Gonzalo because I haven't tasked him with anything yet. So, all right. Okay, we've only got 7 minutes left before we need to hear from the provost. So I'm going to I know we haven't heard from all of the clusters yet. I'm going to certainly invite the panelists to stick around afterwards, so that those of you who did not get a chance to ask questions, to talk to them and to hear some more. I think I'll start with the same order of the speakers. Rachel, you want to take a minute and comment on some of what you've heard?
I'll take a minute, and I also, other members of the American Studies Association are here, so I'd like to invite them to jump in. The main thing I would like to clarify in direct response to the first time we heard the question as it was worded, the boycott does not, academic boycott does not entail a boycotting of any individuals. So yes, you can invite them for conferences. Yes, you can, have them come and give a talk. Yes, you can collaborate with them. Yes, you can co-write a book, and so forth. The boycott very specifically and concretely says that it is a boycott of institutions. So, for example, a university wouldn't partner officially with an Israeli official, institution. Unfortunately, administrators should not go in an official capacity and meet with administrators there. There shouldn't be memoranda of understanding that guide or cover the entire the institution itself. But all sorts of partnership is still open. All sorts of collaboration are still open. And anything involving individuals and the stuff that we can build together when we collaborate together is still ruled in.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah. And I mean, the ASA is just one example, and maybe a particularly weak example, but even that would have interfered with two things that I've been involved with, haven't quite come to fruition, but one of them was something with Benjamin, has he left now? Benjamin Lichtenstein. We were talking about sort of an entrepreneurship, business for peace type of operation that will be supporting joint Israeli-Palestinian businesses as a form of, well, breaking down physically walls and bureaucracy, but also building collaborations there. And the other one is with the Hour of Our Institute, which is part of Ben Gurion University, and an environmental collaboration with them and with Palestinian universities and also in Jordan that they engage with. Those would be blocked by the ASA motion because it's an institutional collaboration, and we were told that, and the Bir Zeit people as well told us they wouldn't work with us if we had a formal collaboration with an Israeli university. So there are things that would block us very directly. To Mitch's point about the political goals, people do see, and this is what I was saying in the Masada complex, I mean, a lot of Jews do see the BDS movement as an existential threat to the notion of Jewish homeland, Jewish identity, and that mixed Jewish sense of nationhood, not just a religion, that we carry around and I think is often misunderstood. The trouble is, you know, we're not all going to get to define what our vision of the future is, right? And these are strategies. In some ways, if you try and sit down and negotiate those up front, you'll have the upfront argument, and it seems rather pointless to me. I mean, it seems better to have the pressure one way or another to stop the occupation, to stop abuse, to stop racism in Israel, and hope that in 20 years or 50 years it evolves to be more of a multicultural, multiracial society. But if you put some things up front, you know, you'll argue, that's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul?
Yeah, my question I think was about what are these, if we have these conversations, what should they accomplish, and presumably if we have them, what should they be about? And so just sitting here next to therapist Gonzalo, I have channeled my answer, which is, what do you think? We should have this conversation about? And in some ways, actually, that is my answer. That in fact, I think that really is, it's not for the four of us to answer that question. And I think some of the answers to that question are here. I think an open discussion, I mean, one of the questions is about what constitutes academic freedom. That's a pretty good basic thing to have a conversation about on campus. We always talk about this thing in the way that, this thing, right? Not this process that Rachel talked about. We always talk about this thing and we invoke it a lot, but I don't know whether we interrogate it very carefully ourselves, and I think that would be a good conversation. This question about political goals and so forth of these kinds of things, or other boycotts in other places and the tactics. I think that there's a ripe opportunity for having these kinds of conversations that will accomplish something about something.
Thank you.
So thank you for saying what I was going to say.
I feel so cured now. I've answered my own question.
Yeah. I'm going to send you an invoice.
I'm going to send myself an invoice.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a very difficult question, and I guess adding to what Paul was saying and what others, I mean, the three of you were saying, Rachel and David. I mean, I do think that that is. We got to be careful. I mean, in this conversation, I think we were very careful at trying to distinguish the content from the process, and I think that I don't have the answer, but I think we need to pay a lot of attention to how we're going to have that conversation, and so that it doesn't become, are you anti or are you pro-Israeli or Palestinian or whatever, independent of how I might feel about it. So, because I think it's very easy to get into that. For me, the issue of self-determination and not having, even if you have a progressive imperialist values, we want to be very careful with that. I'm not an expert on Israeli-Palestinian, but I do think that the conversation has to be done with the agreement that human rights and self-determination and academic freedom, and I agree with Paul, I think we need to talk about it, are important values for us, and it is in that spirit where the conversation should be. For me, the major question in terms of political goals, just to finish my comment, is does it help the cause of the people, whatever we're doing? And that should be, and it's not a rhetorical question. Mm-hmm. It is a real question. Does it help with self-determination? Will it end in authoritarian and repressive regime? I mean, if we do not acknowledge that we have an authoritarian regime that is not fostering self-determination, then I don't know so sure we're going to have a dialogue. But there's a lot of disagreement about how to go about it, even if we call ourselves progressives.
Thank you very much. As promised, I just want to, on an end note, and I think following up on your comments makes good sense, is to check in with you before I hand over to the provost to close the discussion. Are you, to send a message to the organizers of this, is this a conversation you think should continue on campus? We're not deciding whether there should or should not be a boycott. We're only asking whether this conversation should continue. Raise your hand if you think that this conversation should continue. And if you're holding it down, you're saying, I think I've heard enough. My thanks to the panelists, and my thanks to the organizers as well. Close the name.
I was going to say a poem, but I'll say afterwards.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to sit in to listen to the discussion. I think I want to congratulate the colleagues who participated in this discussion as leaders here, and the discussions which continued among the gathered audience. It seems to me that if we believe in something called academic freedom, it would begin with the idea that that freedom is not simply to deal with matters that are routine or matters about which we have a significant agreement. It has to deal with things that have rather profound impacts on our lives. Convictions, I can remember Nietzsche warning us about how easy it is to not the courage of our convictions, but the courage to question our conviction as a greater weight, as it were. And an academic institution should be the site, not only where we seek, receive, and impart ideas, and according to the 19th article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, across frontiers, but it's also the site where we confront information and ideas that go to the heart of our concerns, our prejudices, our preferences, ideals, if you wish, or sentimental ideals. And I would hope that in such discussions we also examine the perhaps unexamined assumptions that sometimes in embracing particular modes of discourse or particular approaches to the solution of a problem, we may not indeed be willing to examine either the hidden goals or the unarticulated goals or the consequences which may ensue from that which we see. The debate helps us to clarify these, and I hope that within this university we can do so with the type of civil engagement that does not estrange us as members of a common community, and that we can also bring others to be part of the debate in the spirit of friendship, if not friendship in the social sense, then in the moral sense. And that as we, as moral friends, seeking certain common ends, and I hope we can define some of these common ends, to see whether we can have some common approaches. And if those are not possible, then of course we can understand better why. As I sat and listened to the group with which I was associated, I did not say very much at all, except to say that I'll be saying something afterwards. It was clear to me that there were different sentiments, there were different sense of what goals may be implied in what is being asked of us in the discussion, and whether we could clarify all of these. I think another session of this sort might lead to some of these clarifications, and that the university might find itself as a site for a broader discussion. At least that's how I hope matters will go. Thank you for being so forthright in what you say. It does not help in a debate to hold back. In fact, it's a false engagement if we hold back. And I hope to the extent we are agreed that we should continue discussion, we will pride ourselves in being truthful and candid to each other. We owe that to all members of the community. Thank you.